Welcome to Something to Talk About, which Monday, Wednesday, and Friday takes place here with the Bainbridge Island Senior Community Center. And today we are working, as we do every month, with the collaboration with the Bainbridge Island Historical Museum. And I'll be introducing Katie Curtis from the museum in just a minute. But I do want to thank Fieldstone Memory Care of Bainbridge Island, which is a sponsor of Something to Talk About. They offer innovative and compassionate care, and they are now accepting residents. To schedule a tour of Fieldstone's beautifully appointed apartments on Rolling Pay today, there's a phone number to call, 360-271-2530. Katie, what have we got in store this day?
Hi, welcome everybody. Thank you so much, Reed. It's always such a pleasure to be doing our programs with you. And as you all have noticed, we've changed from the second Monday of the month. So now we're going to be doing the second Wednesdays of the month. And we're calling our new collaboration History Museum with the Senior Center. So welcome everybody today. My name is Katie Curtis and I'm the Outreach Programs Manager for the Historical Museum. And before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that this program comes to you from Suquamish territory. We'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is within the ancestral territory of the Suquamish people. Expert fishermen, canoe builders, and basket weavers, the Suquamish live in harmony with the lands and waterways of the Central Sailor Sea as they have for thousands of years. The Suquamish live and protect the land and waters of their ancestors for future generations, as promised by the Point Elliott Treaty of 1855. And I just want to acknowledge that it is Native American Heritage Month this month. And so today I'm excited about our program. Our programs are to build community and to let the audience know about wonderful community members that are on Bainbridge Island, people for you to get to know, for you to meet, and then their personal stories on certain topics. And the topic today is the generosity of the island. And I'm very honored to have invited and have Jim Hopper here with us today. So I will let Jim go ahead and introduce yourself. Thank you for being here, everybody.
Terrific. Thank you, Katie, and thank you, Reed. I'm delighted to be here. So I'm going to jump right into my presentation and do my introduction in the midst of that. So I will get us there here now. Okay, so can everybody see this? Okay. So my name is Jim Hopper. I'm the Executive Director of the Bainbridge Community Foundation. I came to this work really through I've spent my entire career either working for nonprofits or working within nonprofits. And right out of college, I was an American history major with an emphasis in Western expansion and a real love of architectural history. And so, so why would somebody who loves architectural history be pointing out this building, which some of you may be familiar with? Well, I'll tell you, because interestingly, this building reflects the American conscience and the local and our local community when it was built. So let me tell you a little bit about why. So coming out of the atomic age, and if you think back to architecture of the post-war era, innovation and technology was at its forefront, and buildings were getting more and more. So that we were headed to the moon and headed to the skies. Buildings were starting to reflect that. You saw architecture that had a space age theme to it and a very forward-thinking theme to it, and as we were going through the post-war growth in the 50s, when the Korean War hit, the first, major U.S. involved war post World War II, there was sort of a desire to regress a little bit, to maybe these pursuits toward life in the skies were a little bit too much, and we needed to become a little bit more grounded. So there was an architectural aesthetic that would sort of build these buildings that had kind of a natural theme to it. And here you can see this mansard roof with this rough-hewn cedar shake was a common architectural element that would sort of make a building feel more approachable, more natural, even though the core of this building is just a big square box. And we saw that actually, that trend move quite swiftly through American architecture, especially roadside architecture, the architecture that grew up around the side of highways. And it also managed to hit here, which is a McDonald's in Caldwell, Idaho, that opened in 1980. And you can see that it has that sort of signature McDonald's roof, which actually was an emanation from that original architectural style. So it's a cousin to the Blue Canary that we have here. This is the very first McDonald's that I ever went into. I distinctly still remember the diamond-shaped windows and the great mysteries that held that. I grew up in a town called Caldwell, Idaho. In the late 70s and early 80s, there was a population around 18,000 people. It was sort of a very quintessential small town. My father was active in city council and chamber of commerce. This is, very near the center of downtown. I could bike there when I was a kid, and there was a little store where you see these stripes. And it was, pardon the expression, it was called George's Gyp Joint. And it was a place where they would sell anything from candy to pornography. And depending on how long kids lingered in the store owner might chase you out of there. But it was it was very much in a sort of idyllic small town. To my earlier reference about architectural history, you can see this building here with the big metal panels. I'm sure that some of you remember that happening to buildings on main streets across the country. It was sort of a modernization of these brick-fronted buildings by just putting these huge metal panels on the front to make them look more modern, and so covering up all of the windows. Well, fast forward to that town today, and it's changed pretty substantially. The population is about 60,000 today. It has increased its geographic footprint, but all of that growth, it has not encompassed any longstanding communities. All of that has been farmland that has been developed and turned into subdivisions. And so now the town's much larger and much more sprawling. And what's also happened is that sense of identity and that sense of small town trust, where you could be a kid and you could make mistakes downtown, that's not necessarily there anymore. The downtown part is geographically quite far away from where the subdivisions are being built today. So it's really about that change that gets reflected. So that community that I grew up in and I really appreciated was really a part of me. And as I grew older, I saw my home community start to change more and more and more as more growth happened. It became more more and more farming was falling by the wayside for subdivisions. These communities were about 15 to 17 miles from Boise, Idaho, which is a very popular community. So we were building sort of very entry-level homes, not homes that people would want to stand for very long. Some homes didn't even have garage doors, but they'd have, kind of like a gaping hole where the garage is. So it just wasn't a very sustainable community. And today it's starting to make a turnaround, but it's becoming a very different community. And so I met my future wife, who was a Bainbridge Island native, and was living in Seattle at the time, and coming over to Bainbridge, a lot of what I recognized about my childhood community was something that I still saw in this community today. And as we moved here and I was doing the commute to Seattle, I really felt like the only position that sort of spoke to me in terms of career-wise on the island at this stage of my life was working for the Community Foundation, where I would have the potential to influence and hopefully continue to build the community in the same sort of vein that I'd inherited. So that was kind of my journey into Bainbridge and into the nonprofit sector, and sort of the reason that I'm here today. But all communities do change, and as they change, they have different needs. But there's this great quote by this woman named Kay Sprinkle Grace, who's one of the sort of foremost authors on fundraising and nonprofit management. And it says that donors don't give to organizations because organizations have needs. They give to organizations because organizations meet needs. And just reinforcing the fact that as we have continued to grow, our nonprofit community has continued to grow. But I want to be clear about the fact that it's not a sort of chicken and the egg situation, in that the nonprofit community grew out of needs that were emanating on Bainbridge Island. And I'll talk through my sort of theory about how those needs are developed in just a moment. But donors stepped up where they saw those needs, and nonprofits were there to be the vessel for meeting those needs. So I'm going to give you my theory on the development of nonprofits and the development of philanthropy on Bainbridge Island. And I've got it broken into these distinctive sort of themes. This is not a historical presentation, and so I'm taking a little bit of creative license in some of this. But I believe that, to the best of my knowledge, my facts are pretty accurate. But if any of you want to point out any flaws that I might be making, I'd be happy to receive those. So first I want to talk, so I'm going to be focusing mostly on Bainbridge's growth from 1940 on, because that's when you saw the beginning of service clubs and the beginning of nonprofit organizations that were starting to institutionalize here on the island. And I'll start with 1940s. So, the post-war America, coming back from World War II, there was in Seattle and all of the neighboring communities this commitment to building the city and to sort of the pride of victory came back, and there was a commitment to doing more for the community. And this is the era in which the American Legion was founded here on Bainbridge Island. Bainbridge Island Historical Society started at that same time, and in 1947, the Rotary Club of Bainbridge Island started. It started originally with business leaders in the Linwood neighborhood, including Judd Huney and some others who helped make that a going concern. Then in the 1950s, I think there was a focus on home. Of course, this was also the point at which the Agate Pass Bridge was built, and there were several things going on in the area. But this, as I had mentioned before, in the influence of architecture, the Korean War, following the end of World War II, the Korean War created kind of an impact on the psyche of a lot of people. And this sort of concern that maybe we've gotten a little bit too big for our britches, and the world was on this progress of getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and I think people were reacting to that. This is the era in which Bainbridge Arts and Crafts was founded by these four ladies who wanted to have a place where artists and craftspeople could gather. Also, a number of our churches. There were a number of new churches that were built through the 50s, but really an emphasis on home and raising the young post-war boomer families. By 1960, I think there were more empty nests as that original sort of greatest generation, the boomer kids, their boomer kids were starting to grow up and leave the home. The 1960s was a time when the Helpline House was started, just originally as a, there was a need in Corinne's church, and she decided that not only did we need to help meet that need that was in the church, but we needed to create an organization then called Fishline, which would provide resources to families that needed it. That's also the time that Bainbridge Performing Arts was founded. The very first Rotary auction in 1960, the proceeds went to building the new Bainbridge Public Library. Kiwanis also formed in the 1960s. And significantly for us all today, One Call for All did too. It was then called the Bainbridge Foundation. And there was beginning to be such a number of nonprofits that were, and charitable causes that were important to Island residents, that the Red Envelope campaign was envisioned as a way to sort of be the fundraising arm for all of these different nonprofits. So they would, by making one gift to One Call for All, donors could ensure that they were supporting multiple organizations in the community. By the 1970s, the boomer generation was starting to have their own kids. And so we saw a huge influx in the amount of education-related nonprofits on the island. Those on the screen, Montessori Country School, the Island School started. So did Bainbridge Island Child Care Centers, the Bainbridge Island Education Association, Friends of the Library, Bainbridge Youth Services. So it was very much a reflection of boomers who'd moved to the island or who were raising their kids on the island, who needed to see additional educational resources in order to effectively raise them. By the 1980s, we saw that the influence of media, of not the internet quite in 1980, but of television was continuing to make the world just a little bit smaller. And we saw more a deepening of the types of organizations that were being formed. So we saw organizations that were giving voice to people who previously didn't have voices. So Parent Teacher Association started at that time. Bainbridge Island Television started at that time as well as the Bainbridge Island Japanese American community started in the 1980s as well. By the 90s, we had boomers that were themselves becoming empty nesters and had more time and more resources to dedicate to their community. We saw another growth and kind of deepening of some of the connections. This was the time when Marge Williams Center was founded. Marge Williams Center, a sort of incubator for nonprofits, a place where they could have inexpensive office space and Housing Resources Board, now Housing Resources Bainbridge, was also formed at that time, as well as Boys and Girls Club and the Bainbridge Island Teen Center and the Bainbridge Schools Foundation. So organizations that are continuing to deepen the relationship that the community has with individual populations, be they nonprofits or teenagers. And then into the 2000s, that refinement continued. So the refined identity of the arts community was manifested by the construction of the Bainbridge Island Museum of Art in the late 2000s. In the early 2000s, our organization started as Bainbridge Island Community Endowment. We were started as a committee of One Call for All, then spun off into an independent organization with the vision that we would be creating a permanent pool of resources that nonprofits could apply to when they had needs that went above what the Red Envelope campaign could provide for them. This was also the era in which the Downtown Association and Friends of the Farms started as well. And then, of course, now we've continued on to prioritizing visibility for all. Some of the signature projects and organizations that have happened since 2010 include the Bainbridge Island Japanese American Memorial Association, the Filipino American Community, officially registered, as well as Bainbridge Pride, which is a focus on LGBTQIA individuals. So this is my kind of very brief history of how, as we've gone through the decades and different priorities at home have helped kind of launch new initiatives. I'll close by saying that when the city of Bainbridge Island, I'll stop my share. City of Bainbridge Island has a citizen survey that they conduct periodically, and they ask Bainbridge Islanders what are the areas of life here that are most important to them, or where do they think the organization's strengths are. We hear about the strong school community. We hear about the access to nature and the parks. We hear about the arts community and the cultural community, and in all of these areas that people love, and the reason that people are drawn to Bainbridge Island. There's a nonprofit organization that's actively working to maintain that piece of the quality of life. And so as our landscape has changed, as our organizations have deepened and broadened in their scope, the benefit of that and the side effect of that has been a deepening and an improvement in the quality of life of Islanders. So that's my kind of quick and dirty about the philanthropy and nonprofits. Are there questions that folks have? Yeah, Reed.
Hi there. Katie, did you want to say something first?
Oh, no, go ahead. I was just going to invite people to ask questions, and I have some questions, but you go first.
So I just was going to put as a little asterisk that in the early 1980s, the Senior Community Center was formed. It was formed by the city, and it was a collaboration from its start. It included staffing from the Bainbridge Island Parks and Recreation District, which I'm curious about. I don't know exactly when that taxing district was formed, but it was a community effort as well. And it was, it's been around since 1983. And then in 2017, we became independent. But that's one of those organizations that I often, when I'm talking to other communities, they'll say, well, gosh, they don't even have a senior center. So I'm thinking that that must have been the kind of thing that somebody thought was a civic requirement at some point. And I know that there were a number of smaller meeting groups around the island before that. There was a group that met at Linwood, and one that met at the Grange, and one that met under the Town and Country Market. And they were consolidated in '83 to the little purchase of a house down by Waterfront Park. So it's just kind of interesting how all these little organizations, as you lay them out, kind of popped up over time as the community started to both grow and the context of our larger world affected how we looked at our responsibilities as a community.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting that you bring up the circles, because I think that that's another, I contemplated kind of basing the presentation on the idea of the circles, because, coming out of from post-war 50s, there was a whole sense of, how are we going to build America now? And it was happening across the country, but there were people, there were people who came together on Bainbridge, like who founded the Rotary, or those, the folks that founded American Legion. And they were a circle of people who wanted to improve the community. And then as that circle started being more effective, then it would spin off another circle that would say, hey, we want to improve the community, and we want to focus on this element of the community. Or, hey, we think what you're doing is great. We want to form this same kind of a community for the artists in the community. And so there's just been this kind of deepening level of connection that has happened, especially on Bainbridge Island, I think, around, and that's happened in this kind of circular fashion.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Reed, for including the story of the Senior Center. I hadn't heard that before. So, Jim, do you feel like there's a specific spirit of Bainbridge when it comes to giving?
Well, I think there is, and I think that it's probably based in the history of the fact that we are an island. Though we do have access points, both highway access points through the bridge and through the ferry system. We know at the end of the day that we're very much reliant on each other when we're here. And I think that when you look historically at the way the island interfaced, with the mosquito fleet, our sense of community might not have been the whole island. You might have had a greater sense of community with the other side of Bridge Passage or the other side of Agate Passage or wherever that point was that mosquito fleet boat stopped was a piece of your community. But and I think that there's been this strong sense of building amenity. When we build amenities here, we know the people, we can see the people who are going to benefit from it. So I think that continued to build. I mean, that's part of this momentum of we know that when we build something here, we can trust. I think a little bit different even than my hometown. I was saying, geographically, it kind of exploded. But here we haven't exploded. We've certainly gotten more dense than we have before, but there's something more tangible about the way you build something on, the corner of the highway and Winslow Way, and people are going to see it for generations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I like to tell folks when I'm talking to them about that we're on Squamish territory, that people walk onto Bainbridge Island and they seem to be magically mesmerized, and people start wanting to move here. And I've learned from relationships with Squamish people that there's just such an abundance in the earth and in the land here that the people here since time immemorial have been welcoming, and one of the most important values was hospitality. Right. And so sometimes I think the spirit goes even that deep, to a sense of beauty and abundance that inspires generosity. So I was wondering, are there any misconceptions or stereotypes you face when encouraging people to give? Now, that's an interesting question, because you also said that actually you don't encourage people to give, that people are inspired to give because the nonprofits are filling a need, right? Is that what you said? The nonprofits
are meeting needs. So yeah, that's what the impetus is. Well, a couple different things. I mean, number one, I think philanthropy in general, we're a little bit hindered by the fact that that's just a big word that lots of people don't identify with and don't feel is, it is a value that they would necessarily identify themselves with. Most of the institutions, when you look back on, those that I highlighted, and the many, there's more than 200 nonprofits on the island. Not all of them are going concerns. Not all of them are for everyone. Some of them are, private foundations. Some of them are water associations. That was a huge thing in the 80s. We built a lot of water. We made a lot of water systems nonprofits in the 80s. There's a lot of organizations, but the organizations that rely on charitable giving, those weren't the result of one donor who came in with lots of money, who decided that this was something that the community needed. Most often the community was, or those organizations were supported by people's hard work and sweat equity first, and then their charitable dollars second. And they weren't necessarily significant charitable dollars in the beginning, and still to this day, they aren't. The majority of organizations on this island are supported by moderate donors who give what they can on an annual basis to support the causes that they care about.
That's such an important point. I think that I know that one of the stereotypes I think about when I think about Bainbridge is that everybody has money, and so sometimes there's a challenge of, well, if it's a popular nonprofit, there must be a lot of rich people that give them money. And that's just not the case at all. But it's definitely the moderate givers that keep the engines running, and sharing, I just appreciate that coming from the Historical Museum. And, I just happen to be excited that there's someone in the audience. I think she's still in the audience. I saw her, Gina Corpus, and I thought, oh, you went through the 2010s, but now once you go to the 2020s, you can include that the foundation, and there's generosity to support the Indopino community now, telling their story. And I don't know if you have a comment on that. I just felt like I saw Gina and didn't know if she had a comment either.
Well, I'm just happy. I'm happy Gina's on the call, and I'm really delighted with the work that they're doing. And I think that that's, carrying on that theme of kind of voices or visibility for all. We are moving on the we're progressing on the stage, up the hill of ensuring that visibility for all. But I think one of the most significant elements, and this is my own opinion, and I'd be happy to have anyone comment on it, but one of the things that's most eye-opening to me about the sort of rise of the identity of the Indopino community is that no one knew about it, and it was here the whole time. So when you talk about the visibility, you talk about giving visibility to these communities that lacked it. I mean, we still don't know what other communities may exist right under our noses that we are missing. But I love that now, we're in this time where we can daylight this important community and their history and their legacy and the impact that they have. And the first time I showed a preview of the Indopino film, this was a little while ago, to some of our donors, I was on a Zoom call and we shared it with everyone, and then we came off the Zoom and there were people visibly crying because they knew those kids from school and they had no idea, right? And they were kids, I mean, there's all sorts of like layered feelings of guilt around, why that happened. But I think it was just incredibly eye-opening to say, not only do we have communities on the island that people are unaware of, and not only have they been sort of like around us the whole time, but they're our friends. They're even our friends that have been in this community that we haven't been largely aware of.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and it also reminded me of when you said that these nonprofits are not created like, oh, that's a good idea, let's create one. They're created from years and years and years of communities and Bainbridge Islanders working on a project.
That's
and
right.
then finally coming and something comes together and can be created as a nonprofit. Gina, did you take off your mute?
I did. Hi, Jim. Hi, Katie. I've really, really enjoyed your presentation, Jim. I like the historical aspect of it and how all the nonprofits and businesses started throughout time. So as you were talking, I was thinking about the fact that the Filipino Farmers Association started in 1935. They were not a nonprofit, but some organizations start as a form of protest against what is. And so with the Filipino farmers, they discovered that they had actually been paid less than the white farmers from the cannery owners. And so that's why they bought the Filipino Hall on 10 acres, is so that they would have a place to deliver their berries and have their berries picked up by Seattle canneries. So I think that a lot of constructive movements, social justice movements happen as a form of protest and resistance to what is. And when we're talking about the Indopino community and the Filipino community, we didn't want to be stuck in time because the Filipino Growers Association moved on to become the Filipino American Community and a nonprofit, which then became a cultural club to retain, revitalize, preserve all of the Filipino culture and traditions. But it was minus the culture and traditions of our mothers. And so in order not to be stuck in time back in the 40s and 50s of just being a Filipino organization, we were forced to be courageous and take risks and start the Mixed Heritage Organization because one, we didn't want to be stuck in time, but two, we had so much work to do because we saw the voids. And like you said, the nonprofits meet the needs. They are the instrument, they're the vehicle in which we identify the needs and then attempt to meet those needs. But of course, we can't meet it without donations and allies. And we have discovered, I shouldn't say discovered, built relationships and allies throughout the Bainbridge Island community that we had no idea really existed. We knew that they liked us, but we didn't know that there was so much support. And it's really been recognized in the film. So thank you to the Bainbridge Community Foundation.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for and for all those who shared their stories. It's pretty amazing. I mean, the more cynical side certainly can look at that timeline that I created and say, okay, well, the 1940s, I talk about post-war kind of growth and that sort of spirit of building the community, but it was being built after a time of incredible pain, right? And after a time in which we kicked out members of our community who were playing on the football team right next to us, and it took from the 40s until the 80s for the Japanese American community to sort of identify to gain that that larger recognition. And then of course the exclusion memorial was 2.5 decades after that. And so so we're slow. And I hope something like this also tells us that between the time of atrocity to the time of recognition and public awakening, I hope that we can kind of narrow those. I mean, I hope there's fewer atrocities, but we've got a lot of damage that we have to pay back, already, that's already been done. So hopefully we can shorten that time. Reed?
Well, I just wanted to thank Gina because I feel like it's also been your hard work that has called the dominant community to awareness that we were blind and now we see. Thanks to work that you've done, and earlier Frank Kitamoto, of course, and colleagues in the Japanese American community. And I feel like Barbara Lawrence and Leonard Forsman have done the same thing for the Suquamish, for us really. And we wouldn't be as aware if it weren't for your hard work in pushing to tell your stories when at times we white people probably didn't want to hear them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well said, Reed. So everybody, I can see from Zoom when people have their hand up like Reed did, so feel free to put your hand up. I have, let's see, another question is, I was just wondering about the conflicting values Jim, that you've had to deal with? What are some of the conflicting values and multiple perspectives that that you know about the island from your?
Well, yeah, and I mean, to be very candid, so community foundations are meant to reflect the values of the community. We are in a more progressive community than some other communities, and as I have looked at as I've worked with colleagues who live in, other parts of the state, many of those parts of the states, many of those being quite conservative parts of the state, I'm very grateful for the community that we live in and the ability that we have to share the voices of people who, to use our to use our position to share the voices of other people, and we have enacted at the foundation some pretty progressive grant making policies around anti-hate and non-discrimination, and we have a subcommittee now working within our board that is specifically focused on going to each of our standing committees and looking at we call our framework ideas for inclusion, diversity, equity, accessibility, and social justice. So the subcommittee kind of meets with each of our committees to say, like, what are you doing to implement the ideas, practices into our work? And it's really cool. So we have a socially responsible investment portfolio, and we ensure that our grants don't go to hate groups and don't go to, even if they're 501c3s in good standing and technically eligible to receive grants, we don't send them if they're actively and directly doing harm to other people. And we're looking at ways that we can leverage additional sort of social capital into the community to help build core competencies and to build a more diverse, more inclusive community. One of the things that we're really proud of right now is the Yes Fund, which is a pool of funds, a pool of dollars that are available through the schools, the high schools, and through Helpline, that when kids have an activity that they can't afford to participate in, whether it's school sports or shoes for soccer or a Model UN trip, we've got this pool of resources that they can get money to participate in those trips, because we all look back on those times in our childhood where we had to go without, right? And it carries with us, and sometimes that if there's enough of those deficiencies, it really creates a limitation to our upbringing. So we're very excited about this. So I'll say that we don't often encounter, because our community is pretty progressive, we've been able to be a pretty progressive community foundation and to kind of step out into a leadership role in some of the more sort of social oriented grant making. But I recognize that we have a lot of other community foundations that just can't get there because their donor base isn't there yet, and their community isn't there yet, and they're having a much harder uphill climb. And I'm sure that there are donors who don't work with the community foundation because we're pretty explicit about our values, and at the time that we sit down with our donors, whether they're most commonly, if they're looking at opening up a donor advised fund, we'll share our practices and say, this is maybe not for everybody, but it is something that we really believe in.
That's good. It's funny. I want to say that's what I was going to say is that's courageous, but it shouldn't be, right? That should be the way it really is.
And I mean, I think it will. Like, it's kind of amazing really from, as you and I have talked about before, Katie, if only people would study history, so many of these problems wouldn't be there, right? Because when you study history, you start to understand the complexities of the world that we live in and the limitations that people operate under. So anyway, but the change that's happening right now and the progress of the change and the speed is just happening. I mean, in any history book, it will be almost an overnight change in some of these cases, because the social awakening is happening so quickly.
Yeah, yeah, and I can't not acknowledge that history also has its own perpetuation of exclusion and harm, and so it is the history, like from Gina, that will teach us these things too. But you're right, even if people would even pay attention to the history from that certain lens, we would learn. So great. Does anybody have any specific questions? I kind of want to, I almost want to do something really like crazy and just acknowledge that my colleague Lillian, thank you for being here. I don't know if you're able to speak, but it would be great to hear from you. Lillian has been, well, she'll have to say, but she's been with the Historical Museum as an intern, and now she's an employee in our collections department. Are you there, Lillian?
I am. I've just been running around in the background.
Well, welcome to this program. Thanks so much for being here. I just wanted to introduce you to the program and have people meet you.
Thank you for coming.
Yep. Thanks a lot. So, are there other questions or comments that people have? Okay, so yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, I was just wondering if you think most people that come to Bainbridge Island understand that it's such a great place because of the work of all the nonprofits over the decades. Do they make that connection?
No, I mean, here's my perception on that. So some do. I should be clear, but we find that some of the people that are most committed to this community and most committed to, have stepped into philanthropy in a big role are people who are new. And in part, that's because when you've lived in other places and you've seen the limitations of other communities, you can come to this community and say, wow, this is really different. I mean, much the same way that I do. I used to love my hometown, and now I can't imagine spending more than 3 days there, right? And but people come here and they recognize that it's different, and so there's definitely some sense of that. And when I started at the foundation 10 years ago, I heard on numerous occasions there are quote unquote, there are too many nonprofits on the island. There are just too many nonprofits. It's a waste of administration. It's a waste of resources. But we've worked to try to kind of point out the fact that, like, behind every single element, there's really not an element of the quality of life here that you can point out that is not, where there's not at least one nonprofit that's working on keeping that going. I think it's becoming more clear, but I think the challenge is still ahead of us in terms of getting, I mean, as the nonprofits are professionalizing, I think it is getting a more complicated landscape, and it's a more complicated landscape for donors who now have, many different organizations that they care about and that they want to support, and potentially limited resources in doing that as well. So I think it's still something that we've got to kind of keep banging the drum about. And I think sometimes the new folks are the quickest to realize that there's value, but no one, I don't think the majority of people on the island, I doubt the majority of people on the island have any understanding of how deep and wide the nonprofit community is here. Per capita, we're kind of off the charts in terms of the number of organizations per capita, and I think a lot of people don't really have any sense of that.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, yeah, and I can remember the aha moment. It was like the city had just cut the funding to the historical museum. The historical museum had gotten 60 grand a year, you know, and we're privileged because the city gives us a really cheap rate for our lease. But all of a sudden, we didn't have any money, and I can remember the aha moment when I realized the people here are paying my salary. It's literally the people I know, you know, and that just gave me such like I felt so humble and so like blown away how you can go from a a business like working for the Gap or whatever and realize or working for a retail store where the money really comes from is from if you're not that connected. But when it was so direct, I just felt like, yeah, I am living and breathing and functioning here thanks to the generosity of you and you and you and all the people I see in TNC. And, I mean, it brings tears to my eyes, and so I think you're right, Jim. I think that's one of the reasons I wanted to have this program was just if we can get in touch with the gratitude for all that generosity and the gratitude for people to be open-minded and try to heal. Like you said, it's kind of like we go from some of us go from a place of blindness to understanding that there's so much healing that has to happen, and to feel like we're in a community where people will pick that up and come alongside us is really important. Well, we have about 5 more minutes, so Sheila, do you have some reflections or anything? I see you there.
Yeah, I was going to say, well, first, there was lots of things I wanted to say about the senior center, but hey, everybody knows that it's the greatest place in the world as far as I'm concerned, along with the historical museum and a few other million places in this town, and I believe that. But this year and as other years, One Call for All comes to me with that double side thing, and you open that up and you say, oh my Lord, all these organizations. And the worst part about it is, of course, trying to figure out where's my $150 going to go, $10 here, $10 here, or whatever, kind of thing, because I have to do it. I want to say one thing. I gave for the first time to the Assistance for the Dogs organization because they were good enough to come on this program, on this Something to Talk About, and talk about their wonderful organization that they have fulfilled a need, a big need. And so there was some of my money for the very first time, and I felt, I thought, oh my goodness, that's amazing. But I am in awe of that, opening that note up, that letter up, and see all of those wonderful organizations. And then I get frustrated because I can't give to all of them.
Yeah. It's interesting in that that model of the kind of community chest is old, right? And not One Call itself was founded in 1960. But what is so cool about that is that in every community I'm aware of, except Bainbridge Island, that's died on the vine. There is no community chest. There is no, here are all the nonprofits you can support. So to your earlier point, Katie, about the sort of spirit here, it definitely says something about the island that we keep, that we open that red envelope and that we look at both sides of it, and we look at those organizations. We read the circular that talks about what these organizations are doing and why it's important, and we give, and we still give through vehicle, even though many of us are also giving direct gifts to the organizations that we directly support. But the idea of that shared value of us all coming together and channeling our giving, whether it's through One Call for All or now through our community foundation, which is, has sort of a similar goal. That sense of community around philanthropy is very, very strong here. And I think one of the most valuable assets that we have in our community.
Thank you so much. This was so great. And I invite people to reach out to Jim at the Bainbridge Community Foundation, and reach out to us if you have any ideas about who you'd like to hear. And Sheila just gave me this dream of, well, maybe we'll just have every nonprofit, have one week for years and years and years. How easy would that be?